Before we start the podcast, we wanted to let you know about WestOS. If you're a teacher or pupil at a school in Scotland, then you now have access to hundreds of quality-assured video lessons created by teachers to support your remote learning. You should be able to find WestOS within the app library of Glow, where you can add the tile to your own personal launchpad. Click on the tile and you'll have immediate access to stream lessons in every area of the Scottish curriculum, with video lessons already available for biology at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher. Now let's get on with the podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Lecky textbooks, revision guides and practice papers, everything you need to learn, review and prepare for your senior phase assessments. Browse the books at www.leckyscotland.co.uk and get 40% off using the discount code LeckyPodcast40. You can now also collect Young Scot reward points by using the codes within the description of each episode to claim discounts and rewards on their website www.young.scot.
Good, solid scientific evidence suggests that brain size in humans has actually been declining now for about 50,000 years.
In this episode, we will be discussing evolution with my university professor, mentor and friend, Steve Hubbard. We'll be joined by Dr. David Norman, a well-known paleontologist from Cambridge University, who has been scientific advisor for television series including Walking with Dinosaurs and Prehistoric Planet. And to add a whole other dynamic to this episode, we'll also be chatting with Poetry World Slam champion Harry Baker and challenging him with a higher biology freestyle rap. As always, we'll be referring to the SQA course specification for higher biology and helping you to try and understand some of the key concepts.
Well, I'm Steve Hubbard. I am now an honorary professor in environmental science at Dundee University. I was a professor at St Andrews University in the School of Biology there. My interests are in evolution and ecology, working on insects and birds, and I have been to the tropics with my host here today, researching tropical bird communities. I met my host when he was a student at the University of Dundee, where I was an associate professor in biology at the time.
So at the most basic level, I guess evolution's the way that living things change over time. And I guess you've also changed a bit since you were at school, Steve. What was your favourite subject at school?
English. I was completely a non-scientist. I was better at non-science subjects at school than I was at science. But I have to say that I was rather lazy overall at school. I didn't really take school that seriously and until it got close to the exams, if I'm ruthlessly honest with you. So my school reports kind of reflect that. But I did click into gear just before my A-level exams in time to get a place at university. So I think clearly the brains were there, but at school I was more interested in, to my father's complete exasperation, fiddling around with motorcycles and playing the piano in a rock and roll band.
How did the rock and roll career go?
I still do it privately, but I wouldn't want too many people listening to it at the moment. I need to practice a lot more. And I'm kind of into the Jerry Lee Lewis sort of stuff, you know.
Did you go anywhere interesting on your motorbike?
Oh, yeah, we went everywhere because it was the only means we had to get around. And I was quite interested at that stage of my life in Formula One motor racing. My father was an engineer, so I enjoyed pulling cars to bits. Did quite a lot of that. But we used to go off to Brands Hatch, Silverstone, pretty well most weekends during the summer season to look at motor racing, and it was always on a motorcycle because when you were 16 until you were 17, that was all you could have. You could have a motorcycle license, but you couldn't have a car license.
What was your own journey like then, from being Steve sitting in the biology class at school to Professor Hubbard?
I think, as with so many things, it was inspirational teachers who change your life. And when I went to, my father said to me he thought there was no future in some of the things that I was interested in. There was no future in engineering. He felt that art subjects weren't really what I should be doing, and he essentially persuaded me that the most modern science at the time, the new kid on the block was biology. So I applied for a biology course. I went to Imperial College in London, and there I met a guy, a Welshman called Parry Jones, who talked to me about insect biology, and he enthused me for the study of insects and later birds. And that enthusiasm carried on, and I did a postgraduate degree at a very famous research institute associated with London University called Silwood Park, which still exists. I did a master's degree there, and from there I went to Jesus College in Oxford to do my doctorate, where I worked research on the control of pests of field crops using their natural enemies. So the idea was to try and take away the use of synthetic chemical pesticides spraying crops and replace them with a more natural form of control. And that actually has been quite successful in places like the Netherlands and Germany, where they do that on quite a large scale. And then I had applied for several jobs, but I was quite young and had no teaching experience, and I kept coming second, which was a bit frustrating. And I was offered a job in Dundee in Scotland. You may know Dundee's in Scotland. And I didn't know where Dundee was. And people kept coming into my office and saying, "Why are you going to this interview in Dundee? You must be mad." And I'm a sort of belligerent kind of guy. If somebody tells me not to do something, generally I will do it. So if they want me to do something, they have to tell me to do the opposite thing. And because people kept telling me I would be crazy to take up a position in Dundee, I decided I would go and have a look. And it was a 1-year position, which would give me the experience I needed in teaching, so that I could go back down south and apply for jobs again, and this time come first instead of second. But the problem is, when I got to Dundee, I really liked it. And I really liked the quality of life. I liked the people I was sharing the department with, the fellow members of staff. I liked the students. I liked the general environment of Scotland. I did quite a lot of exploring of Scotland north of Dundee. So at the end of the year, I managed to persuade my wife, against her better judgment, that we should move to Dundee and start a different kind of life there. And I have been offered jobs in the intervening time back in the Thames Valley, various places in the Thames Valley, like London, but I was never even remotely tempted to take them because life now is here. My family have grown up here. My children are all Scots. My grandchildren are all Scots. So I'm here, and I don't see myself going back.
Now we know that Steve isn't going anywhere, and with the knowledge that his favourite subject at school was English rather than biology, I thought we might focus in on evolution by starting with a poem from one of my own favourite poets.
Hello, my name is Harry Baker. I am a poet, and this poem is called An A to Z of Time and Space, and it's trying to kind of match that progress of time with progress through the alphabet, I guess. And it goes like this. First there was nothing. I'm talking nothing but nothing, then there was something. In amongst that nothing was something. And something, someone split into some things, and some things even managed to become things. So take Adam. Adam was added up out of atoms. Before that, it was black and barren. Then it became big and banging out of the chaos, countless crazy complex patterns. And then dun, 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 dinosaurs happened. Through evolution, everything's edited every day. That's how we fine-tune, finesse, and then finally find our way. Just as the galaxies have gotten to gear, the game changed because hip, hip, hooray, Homo sapiens came. And we invent, imagine, inspire, and innovate. We journeyed from jamming in caves to jamming jam in a cake. That knack for knowledge knitted and knotted away like silent caves. We learn the language of living. Often a little late, we make music. We maneuver mathematical methods. We've noticed and noted the nodes of our own neural networks overflowing, outpouring, open mics to operatics with the pork percentage purported in pepperoni packets. Because we question. From quick quizzes to quantum quarks, revolutions of the heart to renaissances of art, you see, scriptures and science seek signs of the sublime, meanwhile through trees triggers the entirety of time. Our universe is unfinished, but utterly underway. Its vibrancy vibrates via ventricles, valves, and veins. You see, we wonder and we wonder. We explore and we explain. We yearn for what is yonder. As we zoom out into space, we can forget that we were not the first to be here. By any stretch, we will not be the last to leave. And whilst we can't control our history or know our distant future, we can make the most of what might lie between. We can be kind. We can accept the kindness of others. The world shows us what we allow ourselves the time to discover. We can listen, truly listen to another person's needs. Not just wait until they stop talking to take a turn to speak. We can be brave enough to try and make all kinds of mistakes. We can be playful because what is a life without play? We can remind ourselves each day it's not too late for new beginnings when a single moment can hold the whole universe within it. Because when we zoom out, we realize how small it becomes. So either none of it matters, or all of it does. From atoms, Big Bang, chaos, dinosaurs, evolution, the fine-tuning of the galaxies to humans. Imagine that journey of knowledge through language and music notes overflow with the poetry of quantum revolution. As the sublime trickles through the universe's veins, we wonder, explore, yearn, and zoom out once again. Because when we zoom out, we realize how small it becomes. So either none of this matters, or all of it does.
Wow. Thank you, Harry Baker.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to the Higher Biology Podcast.
Happy to be here. Happy to be here.
We'll come back to Harry later to hear a little bit about the world of slam poetry and why Ed Sheeran's been quoted as saying that Harry's a champion. For now, though, let's get started by recognising that evolution is not something that happened in the past. It is ongoing. And as humans, we've only been around for a very, very small part of it so far.
Well, you know, we need to remind ourselves that human beings are very late comers to the evolutionary stage. The Earth is about 5,000 million years old. And creatures that we could call relatively human, if you like, have been around for only 7 million years. We separated from the last common ancestor that we shared with chimpanzees, who are our closest relatives, about 7 million years ago, which is hardly any time at all. So evolution is often depicted as a clock, you know, where the clock is ticking around in seconds towards midnight. Well, we're really, 2 or 3 seconds before midnight in the grand scheme of things. So we are very late comers. And it's a big surprise to me that we've been so successful, because we have radically changed the world over the very brief time that we've been here. And in that time, we've gone from being relatively small-brained, walking on all fours, to being much larger brain. There's a relentless pattern of increase in brain size over that time. Walking on 2 legs, we've acquired enormous intelligence, so you might think we don't use it very much sometimes. And the capacity to think forward, anticipate problems, head them off and do something about them before they come serious. But there's no evidence of that in the real world. I think that man's evolutionary journey has been an interesting one. I think the most interesting questions to do with human evolutionary journey is, where are we going from here? Because evidence suggests, good solid scientific evidence suggests, that brain size in humans has actually been declining now for about 50,000 years. So that initial period during which we had a pretty relentless increase in brain size seems now to have come to a halt. And we mustn't forget that there are other organisms on the planet too that are as intelligent as we are. Dolphins, for example, are every bit as intelligent as we are. It's just that we can't understand them because they live in water. They talk to each other, but they can't talk to us, and we can't talk to them.
I think it was possibly in the first edition of Charles Darwin's book in 1859 on the origin of species, where Darwin speculated about how natural selection could cause a land mammal to turn into a whale. I don't think it was a dolphin, I think it was a whale. And I think at the time he used some sort of bizarre example of a black bear which was known to catch insects by swimming with its mouth open, which I think was pretty ridiculed at the time, to the point that I think he took it out of kind of further editions. But he was possibly onto something. And maybe if he'd considered cows and hippos, he would have been better received. What can you tell us about natural selection, and what examples stick out to you?
Well, that's a very good example you picked there, actually, because you've got to remember that before whales evolved, the dominant predators in the seas were giant marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and mosasaurs. And they were occupying, sitting solidly inside that ecological niche. And you know that when an ecological niche is occupied, it's very hard for anything else to get in there. But of course, in 65 million years ago, a massive asteroid collided with the Earth in the Gulf of Mexico, and the climatological consequences of that led eventually to the demise of all of the dinosaurs except the birds. And birds are, we should remind ourselves, dinosaurs. Whether we like it or not, that's what they are. But that ecological niche in the oceans was completely empty at that point. And the evolution from a land mammal to a whale, something like a blue whale, was astonishingly rapid. In evolutionary terms, that process took only about 50 million years, which is an incredibly short period of time for a change of that magnitude to occur. And so that has got to stand out as an example of selection. And you think about the process that must have been involved. You've got something which is air-breathing, walking on all fours on dry land, eventually becomes something that is air-breathing, but has lost its hind feet. Its front feet have turned into flippers, and it has assumed an enormous size in order to preserve its own internal environment, its body temperature, in places that are very, very cold. Other examples would be things like insects that have become mimetic, that is to say, they're immature stages. If you think of butterflies, for example, they eat plants which contain lots and lots of poisonous chemicals. The caterpillars eat the plants. The poisons don't affect them, but they concentrate them in their bodies and then pass them on to the adults. The adults advertise the fact that they're poisonous by being very bright colored. They're bright red, yellow, white, black, those kinds of colors, and predators avoid them. And that whole process has been brought about by selection. And we know that at the end of the last ice age, the Amazonian rainforest, as we know it today, did not exist. There were little pockets of rainforest in South America, but not the great mass that we see today. And in each of those little pockets was a small population of butterflies that had locally adapted to resist the attentions of its own local predators by being brightly colored in a particular way. And in each little patch, the bright color pattern was different. And when the forest grew back at the end of the Ice Age to be what it is today, those patterns were preserved exactly as they had been something like 20,000 years ago. So you see examples like that, and it's very clear that what is going on there is the process of natural selection exactly as Darwin envisaged it. It's worth saying for your students that Darwin's theory is very unusual in great scientific theories because it hasn't really changed since Darwin proposed it back in 1859. Well, indeed, he knew about it before that. And Darwin did it when he was a very young man. This is the contribution of a young man, not a contribution of somebody who'd spent a lifetime doing this kind of work. And sometimes to the frustration of some people, his theory hasn't really changed. We know a bit more about some of the mechanisms by which selection works, and we're able to peer more clearly into the molecular biology of it now. But the essence of evolution by natural selection is exactly the same now as it was when Darwin first proposed it in the 1850s.
That idea of natural selection, it's obviously a non-random increase in the frequency of DNA sequences that increases the chances of survival for the next generation. What else would you add to that for young people?
Natural selection implies that there's some sort of process going on, doesn't it? If the changes in gene frequencies were random, and we know that every characteristic that we all possess is a product of two things. It's a product of inheritance, the characters that are handed down to us from our parents, and it's a product of the environment in which we live. So every single character possessed by every single organism on the face of the earth is a product of genotype, environment interactions. And Darwin was concerned with the genetic part of that, although let's remind ourselves again that Darwin didn't know anything about genes. None of that was understood by him, and that didn't come into the general understanding of science until Mendel's time, when he started to do his classic experiments on genetics. So Darwin didn't know that, but selection, of course, acts on the heritable part of our characteristics, that bit that's passed on to us by our parents. And we now know, since Crick and Watson's discovery in 1953, that depends on DNA. And DNA is the material from which our genes are constructed, and the genes are the things that determine the characteristics we have. Of course, we carry a lot of genes around us which do nothing. A very small part of our genotype actually has some sort of function. But what selection does is to change gene frequencies from generation to generation, as you said a moment ago, in a non-random way. And that's what natural selection is. Now, mostly natural selection keeps things exactly as they are now. So unless you have some major change in the external world, then natural selection will tend to press in from both sides. We call that stabilizing selection. So the majority of natural selection is stabilizing and will tend to keep the world the way it is now. And that's how it works. It's only if you get a change in the external world, then the kind of selection we get begins to change along with that.
And that could obviously be directional selection or disruptive selection, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you get directional selection is where an organism has been living under one set of ecological circumstances and something changes. It might be a change in the climate, for example, such as we're experiencing now. That would be a very good change, a very good example, of a physical change in the environment. And that means that the genes that the organism possesses, the DNA that it has now, is no longer best suited to that environment, and genes which are better suited to it will begin to experience positive selection at the expense of the genes that were suited to the old environment. So you'll get old environment genes, if you like, and new environment genes, and what will happen is that the new environment genotypes will increase at the expense of the old environment genes, and the population will gradually change. And then that is when you get evolution occurring. You get some sort of directional change.
And I guess in those circumstances, it's really it would be selections favouring one extreme of the phenotype range
exactly.
to suit the new environment. And then disruptive selection, therefore, would be a form of natural selection that favours two or more phenotypes.
Well, disruptive selection is very rare for start, because it occurs when a genotype is the average genotype in a population is the one that is selected against, which experiences adverse selection. And that would occur when something like the place where an organism had been living was somehow suddenly changed in a radical way, perhaps a volcanic eruption or something of that kind in the physical environment. And the organism had to change itself to live in a place that it would really rather not live if it had a perfect world in which to live. Now, we can see some evidences of that in Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands. We see that if you have one particular finch living on an island on its own, then the size of food on which it chooses to feed is reflected in the size of its bill. But if it is on an island, another island, a separate island, where it has to share that island with another species of finch, then neither of them can eat the thing they'd like to eat, and each one chooses to eat something either slightly bigger or smaller in order that they don't have to compete with one another, those kinds of things. So selection is that, in that case, is pushing species apart in the kinds of food they eat. And that process can occur within a species. And when it occurs within a species, we call it disruptive selection, because it acts against the commonest genotype present in the population.
Certainly, we were lucky enough to take some of our own students to Galapagos and saw the finches for ourselves. And that was something that was very much inspired by the time that we obviously spent together in the tropics in Trinidad. Part of that was obviously a huge study on tropical versus temperate bird species. What can you tell us about that study? And obviously a little bit of genetic work done with banana quits from memory as well.
That's right. There's an ongoing study on the gene frequencies of different species called banana quits, as you said, in the various West Indian islands, and we're cooperating with universities in America to complete that study at the moment. But that study was about the ecological differences that have arisen through time, through evolutionary time, in tropical birds as opposed to birds that live in temperate places like Scotland. In temperate places like Scotland, we have completely distinct breeding seasons. Birds arrive here, or they wake up here in the spring. They start to think about breeding, and they breed in the early spring because it's in the spring that the insect food supply that they need to feed their young becomes most abundant. So birds that are arriving here from Africa are coming here because suddenly in the spring and the early summer in Britain, there's a huge flush in insects that they can use to feed their young. When that flush in insects has gone around the middle of June, beginning of July, and the breeding season in Britain is effectively over for birds, with one or two exceptions, and they will carry on the rest of their lives for the rest of that year until the following season, and they do the whole thing again. So in Britain, we see birds with distinct breeding seasons. In the tropics, we have something completely different, because in the tropics, it's warm all the year round, and insect food is available the whole time. So birds can breed around the clock, if you like, in the tropics at any time of the year that they choose to do. And one of the consequences of that for birds living in tropical rainforest systems is that because there are the eggs and nestlings of birds constantly available through the year, there's a whole ecological guild, as we call it, of predators that specialize in preying on eggs and nestlings of birds that we simply don't have in Britain. In the tropics, they are mostly snakes. And one of the consequences of that we see is that birds in the tropics have evolved a whole complexity of mechanisms for avoiding the attentions of snake predators. Of course, in Britain, we don't have that because there isn't enough food there. Well, we don't have as many snakes for a start, but there isn't enough food there for a snake to evolve to become a specialist nest predator on eggs and nestlings in Britain. So one of the consequences of that is in the number of young that birds produce in the tropics. In the tropics, because they have the attentions of nest predators, they have evolved to become very averse to any kind of predation pressure, whereas in Britain, say, for example, predation of nests is really quite a serious problem. So survival of young in the tropics is a little bit higher than it is in temperate regions. And a consequence of that is that the birds lay slightly fewer eggs in the tropics than they do in Britain, because the rate of survival of birds in the tropics is a little bit higher than it is in temperate regions like Britain. And the essence of the work that you and I did together in Trinidad was to study whether or not, by marking birds and recatching them in a season's time and maybe a season after that and so on, whether their survival is really higher in the tropics than it is in temperate regions. Now, we know a lot about the survival of birds in Britain because the British Trust for Ornithology has a massive ringing scheme into which anybody can enroll. Your students could do that and learn about bird ecology in the field here in Britain. But rather little is known about the same things for most tropical bird species, and that's what we were there to do. And in fact, the data set that you helped to gather is now the longest running data set for tropical bird ecology anywhere in the world. So it's a very valuable scientific resource that you helped to compile.
You're absolutely welcome. And that was obviously, certainly my role was such a small part of an ongoing study that you'd certainly been involved in for, I think, 20 plus years. For young people that are maybe considering getting into science, some of the kind of exciting field work is maybe one of the attractions for them. How did you actually come to getting involved?
Well, I was doing field work myself one day at Oxford when I was doing my doctorate at Oxford, and I was talking to a guy called Claude Rivers, who had been on an expedition to South America, and he chatted to me about it, and I became so intrigued by it, I started to look into it. And it was about that same time that I got my job in Dundee. And in the first year or two, I was approached by some young students at that time saying, would it be possible to organize an expedition? And I thought back to my conversation with Claude, and I thought, well, yes, why don't we think of somewhere to go? And after a little bit of consideration, I hit on Trinidad. And the reason for that was that Trinidad is so close to the South American mainland, although it is an island. It's only 8 degrees north of the equator, so it's very, very, very far south in the tropics. Because there's a grand tradition of ecological research done in Trinidad by the New York Zoological Society in America, by a very famous ecologist called William Beebe. There is the advantage that Trinidad was a former British colony, so the entire scientific educational system there has been conducted in a way that we would recognize straight away. And of course, they speak English, which means if you want to do research there, you don't have to learn Spanish or Portuguese in order to talk to local scientists and local academics and people. You can do it in English. So there are lots of day-to-day reasons why working there is easy, but yet, as I said a moment ago, it is so close to South America that all of the biology of Trinidad is absolutely typical of what you would see in the adjacent tropical regions on the mainland, like Venezuela and the Amazon basin. And that work began there, and we began looking at various animals and plants. We looked at bromeliads, air plants, with a guy called Howard Griffiths, who was a student at Dundee. He came to Dundee with 2 E's in his A-level through clearing, and he's now a professor of plant ecology and plant sciences at Cambridge. So the message there is anything is possible if you're prepared to work at it. He's still working on it, and he's still working in Trinidad. John Riley, my colleague John Riley, was interested in snakes and other reptiles, in particular in the parasites that live in their lungs and respiratory tracts. And I was interested in birds and insects. So we went in 1981 with a very varied expedition. And gradually over the years, that focused down around birds. And there was a little gap in my own visit, but the research was carried on through students at Glasgow University, and they still go to Trinidad because one of my old students is now a member of staff at Glasgow University, and he still goes. And then I was approached by a bunch of young students in 2007 to see if I might consider mounting an expedition. And you are one of that group of students. And I said, yes, why don't we go back to Trinidad and see what the birds are doing? And we picked up the baton there of ringing the birds again, and we carried that on. And the last time we were there was in 2015. But we hope to go back to have one last check on what the fate of all those ring birds has been. And then we're in the business of analysing the data and publishing the outcome.
When are we going back?
Well,
earlier, Steve stated that dinosaurs were birds. So before I get caught up in planning a return to the Caribbean someday, this seems like a good time to introduce Dr. David Norman from Cambridge University.
Hello, my name's David Norman. I'm working at the University of Cambridge, and amongst my many interests are dinosaurs. So there is a now well understood connection between dinosaurs and living birds. That's very valuable because it means that dinosaurs didn't go extinct at the end of the Cretaceous era, but actually survived, but only in the form of these rather curious feathered animals that we now call birds. Technically, I suppose we should call them dinosaurs, but they're dinosaurs with feathers. The story of dinosaurs and their relationship with birds themselves is really quite an old one. It goes back to the late Victorian era when it was realized that there are some dinosaur fossils that looked very small and had rather delicate bones. And a chap called Thomas Henry Huxley, who was a friend of Charles Darwin, said, they look rather like the structure that you see in birds. So could dinosaurs and birds be related? The idea was put forward, but nobody really took it up. The sort of ideas were fixed. Dinosaurs are reptiles. They have a particular way. They are big and scary, and they're probably cold-blooded. Birds themselves are warm-blooded, highly active, not at all like dinosaurs. So perhaps that was a mistaken view at the time. And that was the prevailing opinion. Later on, many years later, almost a century later, a good friend of mine called John Ostrom collected a very interesting fossil from Montana in the USA. It was a predatory dinosaur. If you've seen Jurassic Park, then you know the word raptor, and this was the prototype of the raptor type of dinosaur. And what he realized was that this dinosaur was highly active, very fast-moving, and surprisingly bird-like in its overall anatomy. So that was the beginnings of a realization that some dinosaurs could be highly active and did look rather bird-like. So there was a lot of discussion about how active dinosaurs were, how warm-blooded they might have been, what their relationships to birds could be. And this was pushed forward, and John Ostrom was very central to the idea that some dinosaurs were rather like birds. And is that similarity coincidental? Is it a matter of parallel evolution or convergence? Or is it actually that they have a fundamental biological relationship? They are related. That was discussed for quite a long time until in China, in the late 1990s, some fossils were discovered of raptor-like dinosaurs with a fringe of little filaments around the outside of the body. They were preserved in exceptional conditions. And this raised the possibility that small, active dinosaurs had a sort of furry or feathery covering. Later dinosaurs discovered over the next decade were small, rather bird-like, and also were preserved with feathers. And this finally reinforced the link that had been spotted by Thomas Henry Huxley back in the 1870s, that birds and dinosaurs are not only similar, but are very close relatives. And now it's really unarguable. Dinosaurs gave rise to birds. Not all dinosaurs died at the end of the Cretaceous. The ones that survived are the birds that we know and love today. So dinosaurs didn't go extinct. One group survived, and they are the wonderful birds that we're familiar with today.
I guess what you've described there, David, could really be seen as a bit of a dinosaur renaissance, really.
Yeah. It's one of the students of John Ostrom was called Bob Backer, and he was very aware of the potential interest of people in understanding whether dinosaurs were highly active and more sophisticated in terms of the biology, rather than being old and cold-blooded, which was a common view at the time, back in the 1960s and 1970s. So he was a promoter of this idea, quite a controversial chap. He came up with various theories, many of which have been discarded. But the fundamental truth is there, that dinosaurs and birds share a number of anatomical and probably physiological similarities that suggest that dinosaurs are very active types of creatures, even if they lived in a rather curious world.
Yeah, you've got to remember that dinosaurs were present on the Earth for a very long period of time, which consisted of three geographical eras, the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous, which together we call the Mesozoic. And that was a period in the Earth's history where the Earth was essentially tropical from pole to pole. So conditions which were tropical or subtropical prevailed all the way from the North Pole to the South Pole. So the Earth was very warm, very moist, exactly as you would find it now if you were to go to a place like the Amazon basin. So under those circumstances, speciation and ecological diversification is rapid, and the consequence of that was that there were many, many, many species of dinosaurs on the Earth. And one branch of that, I mean, there were 6 major groups of dinosaurs that existed in that time. Some of them were ecologically not terribly successful. Ones like the stegosaurs, for example, actually managed the incredible feat of dying out before the Great Extinction 65 million years ago. Some of the others were not, terribly successful. The big ones like Brontosaurus, Diplodocus, the large herbivores, they were beginning to undergo something of a decline. But the more advanced ones, the horned dinosaurs, for example, like Triceratops, were doing extremely well. And the ones from whom birds are descended were doing especially well. If you look, and you can see many modern features in these modern dinosaurs. If you look at a skeleton of Triceratops, and I was looking at one in the Natural History Museum in London just the other year, you see some very modern features in that the animal is walking with its legs in line, not sprawled out to the side like a lizard. And it's walking on the tips of its toes, just like modern horses do and modern herbivorous vertebrates do. So in terms of its locomotion, it's very, very efficient. Birds, which move with their limbs in line instead of a sprawling gait like this, like alligators and so on, crocodiles, they hold their limbs to the side, and it's very hard to walk like that. As soon as your limbs come in under your body, as with most dinosaurs, then the whole business becomes much more efficient. And there's no question whatever that some dinosaurs were warm-blooded. Now, the stalwarts at the British Museum refer to dinosaurs as reptiles. It's infinitely more complicated than that, because some of them clearly were warm-blooded and very ecologically successful. Well, when the asteroid hit the Gulf of Mexico 65 million years ago, the climatic and ecological consequences of that were to empty many ecological niches which had been filled by dinosaurs. And the things that flooded into those niches were, of course, the mammals. And the survivors were the birds. And the Achilles heel that birds carry around with them, birds are, let's not forget, there are many more bird species on the earth now than there are mammals. So birds are still very, very numerous, but they're nowhere near as numerous as they were 65 million years ago. But they carry around with them a little bit of baggage that they're never going to get rid of, which is that they lay eggs. And eggs are their vulnerability, because eggs are vulnerable to predation. And that's why birds try and keep the period that the young are in the nest as brief as they possibly can. So a bird of a given size will develop something like 25 times as rapidly as a young mammal of the same size, because they're trying not to be in the nest and vulnerable for that time. So birds are dinosaurs, and they have characteristics which are absolutely typical of dinosaurs, small predatory dinosaurs of around that time, but they have changed in a whole variety of ways. If you looked at the skeleton of a bird now and the skeleton of a small carnivorous dinosaur at the end of the Cretaceous, you would find it very hard to tell the difference between them.
Within the higher biology course specification, it states that a species is a group of organisms capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring, and which does not normally breed with other groups. Speciation is the generation of new biological species by evolution as a result of isolation, mutation, and selection. Steve went on to explain a bit more about this process.
I think it's worth saying for your students that pretty much all speciation events have to have some degree of physical isolation. So you have, if you like, a founding population that somehow becomes divided into, let's say, into two would be the simplest example. And in those two subpopulations, which are prevented from exchanging genetic material, gradually become adapted to the new environments in which they live, to the point that if you then bring individuals from them together again, they're no longer capable of interbreeding. And that process starts with some sort of separation event, the provision of a sort of so-called breeding barrier. Now, you can see how that works in the sort of systems you were living in, because the mountain range in the north of Trinidad where we were working consists of a series of very large peaks. If you take away the forest and the valleys between two of those peaks, for example, you're taking away the highway through which birds, in this case, can commute from one of them to the other. And so that's the very beginning of the process, which, if carried on for long enough, will result in speciation by geographical isolation. And it can occur on very small scales. It only depends how big you are. I mean, if you're a fish living in a stream, and there's a lot of work been done on fish called guppies in those habitats, you can be as close to another population as maybe 10 yards away. But if you're prevented from exchanging genetic material with it, then that's the raw material for speciation. And you can actually get two species evolving, two separate species evolving from one, but they're only separated by matters of meters. And the only thing that matters in that process is the fact that the physical separation prevents them from interbreeding.
And of course, it doesn't just have to be geographical barriers. It could also be behavioural or ecological barriers as well.
Yes, that's right. Anything that prevents interbreeding is something that will... All that needs to happen is that the interchange of genetic material is stopped or impeded in some way, and that will begin to lead to the process of speciation.
These behavioural or ecological barriers lead to sympatric speciation, while geographic barriers lead to allopatric speciation. Within the higher course, you might want to consider doing one of the suggested learning activities and researching the London underground mosquito, which is a really interesting story in its own right. For now, though, I finished up my conversation with Steve by asking him whether he thought that the things that had made humans so successful on the planet might possibly be the reason for our own downfall.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. I think we've got to learn some important messages here, because you're right, the big change, if you think of Darwin's theory, which is the sort of core of what we're talking about here, in a sense, human beings are able to bypass that a little bit, because I can teach you to do something which will affect your Darwinian fitness without passing any genes to you. I could teach you, for example, to shoot a bow or throw a spear, and that would enable you to gather food. Now, that is the cultural transmission of information from me to you, which has an effect on you of increasing your fitness. Whereas Darwinian selection, as conventionally envisaged, is simply the passing on of genes from one individual to an offspring that affects their fitness. So what human beings have done, because of this massive increase in their intelligence, is to be able to pass information between one another in a way that increases our survival and our reproduction. And we've done this very successfully. And of course, we're social animals. We've learned that by grouping together, we can be more effective in doing this than we can as individuals. That living in groups probably evolved in humans on the African plains as a result of predation pressure, because human beings at that time were no bigger as adults than 10-year-old children are today. And there were a lot of very, very large predators around in Africa at that time. So the way that they would survive in those sort of circumstances is by living in groups. But of course, that consequence lives with us today because we now have very large brain size. We have the capacity to solve very complex technical problems. And the consequence of that is that we're exploiting the Earth's ecological resources at an exponential rate. And that, of course, can't continue. A lot of people who ought to know better in the contemporary world will tell you that it can continue, and those people are mostly politicians. But it can't continue because the Earth is a limited resource, and it contains limited resources, and we can't go on using them at an ever-increasing rate. So the world that your students need to look forward to, and the words that they need to hear coming out of the mouths of politicians and others, are words like sustainable. We have to learn to live in a sustainable world. We have to learn to do that without falling out with one another, because our technological mastery of the world is so great that if we fall out with one another badly, the consequences for the Earth could be very serious indeed.
Yeah, what message or advice would you give to young people, obviously in sort of 5th, 6th year at high school and thinking about their next steps out into that world?
First advice I would give to them is to do the thing you enjoy and don't listen to anyone else because that person tells you you'll get a job. What's most important is that you do something that you enjoy, because you'll be good at that. If you allow yourself to be persuaded to do something you don't enjoy, then you won't be any good at it, and it becomes a kind of downward spiral of non-achievement. So do the thing that you enjoy and try and get as broad an experience for yourself before you make that choice as you possibly can. It is crucial that a proportion of intelligent young people go into environmental research and environmental policy. These people need to be well informed, because they're people who are going to make the crucial decisions in the coming years. What we need now are people in those sorts of positions of power who understand the reality of the world in which we live and the fact that we can't go on exploiting it in the way that we are. If we don't do something about it now, think it through, establish some policies, get them in place, and carry them through to fruition, then it will get worse and the solution will become harder. So the longer we keep putting that solution of sustainability off, the harder it will eventually become for our children and grandchildren to solve that problem in a peaceful way. And that, of course, is the danger. Conflict lies always at the heart of this, because eventually animal ecology tells us when resources become scarce, individuals fall out. And falling out between humans isn't an insignificant thing these days, I'm afraid.
The only last thing is to say an absolutely massive thanks. Certainly, it might not have been a spear and a bow that you passed on to me, but it certainly was the machete skills and even some statistics skills alongside an awful lot of other things. And actually, it's probably worth mentioning that if it hadn't been probably for some of the conversations that took place in Trinidad, I might never have the confidence to go on and become a biology teacher myself. So on behalf of all the students now unfortunate enough to sit in front of me, you're thoroughly to blame for that. But on a very personal level, thank you.
Oh, well. You're welcome, Paul. You're welcome. Yeah, I remember your machete skills very clearly.
Before we finish up, let's go back to Harry, who's lived Steve's advice and followed his own passions to become a world champion. Is that correct, Harry?
Yes, I got involved in poetry through these poetry slams, which basically meant you would perform and the audience would kind of hold up a scorecard and vote for it. So the emphasis was on connecting with whoever was in the room. And it means that if you win a slam, you can call yourself a slam champion and pretend you're some kind of wrestler. And if you don't win, you can tell everyone that it's hard to judge poetry anyway. That's awesome. And how did you get into poetry? You obviously write a lot of poems that have sort of revolve around, science, evolution today. I've heard some great ones about dinosaurs, and there's a fantastic one about prime numbers as well. Yeah, so I studied maths at university, and poetry was always a way to escape. But I think my mind has always been one that thinks very logically and has that kind of scientific, methodical nature to it. So I love playing with language, whether that is rhythm or rhyme, and that kind of comes through. But then I also love the sideways lens that poetry can give you to look at things differently and to try and find beauty in the ordinary or in places where you might not normally expect it. So I love any chance to kind of bring those two sides of my brain together, or those two worlds together. And so I think the maths and the poetry, more recently at least, I've tried to play around with both a bit more.
We've just been speaking with Steve Hubbard and discussing evolution, and his favourite subject at school was English, but it led him into science. So I guess you've started with maths and then gone towards more sort of English-based poetry.
Absolutely. We've done the opposite routes. When I was studying maths, I was writing poetry for fun. And I realized that now I do poetry full time. I've started reading maths books for fun, which is something my teenage self would never have thought possible. But I think, there's a definite freedom that comes from both.
And what advice would you have for any young people listening that are maybe interested in getting into poetry, or are actually maybe think they have no interest in poetry?
I think for me, it always came from a sense of playfulness. So the same way that I would love to learn the words to my favorite songs, I would try and write my own stuff. And as a teenager, that was trying to be a rock star and then a rap star and then whatever. But that idea of lyrics being fun. And I think if your first introduction to poetry is through, harrowing war poetry or whatever, you kind of think it has to be this particular somber, serious thing. And while I think poetry is amazing at capturing all kinds of emotions, including the more powerful, serious stuff, I think it can be really fun as well. And that's something that I think sometimes we forget. So I think if you can play with it, see what comes out of it with no pressure, then hopefully you can find your own voice within that.
And within poetry slams, what does a poetry slam involve then? Does that involve a sort of specific format?
So the format, the only specifics was that you had to perform out loud something you've written yourself, and there was a 3-minute time limit on it. And what that meant is that the certain style that tended to thrive at these slams were ones that were more high impact, kind of pacier, and it came out in America sort of alongside the hip hop movement. So there was this sense of rhythm and rhyme in there too. But there's no specific rule about what a slam poem has to be. I've seen performances that are very short, very gentle, and equally hard hitting and powerful. I think it just meant that because you had people in front of you, there was an incentive to be engaging, whether that was trying to make people laugh, trying to give people goosebumps. It was about that live connection there and then, as opposed to a poem being something that exists at arm's length on a page that someone might read at some point. It was a very instant here and now thing.
In that sort of here and now, did they ever just give you a topic and make you sort of come up with something on the spot?
Yeah, there's been a few. Sometimes there's been like a tiebreaker where you have to just respond to whatever's going on. And actually more recently, I have got back involved with music, and I do some freestyle rap stuff where it depends on people's expectations and how forgiving the audience is. So when I do it in schools, it's really fun because I'll get words from sort of some of the students and just try and not stop. And as long as you get through to the end, you sort of get away with it, I think.
You up for giving it a go?
Absolutely.
Why don't we try and come up with something basically around the idea of the Higher Biology podcast?
So I'll give it a go. This is the Higher Biology podcast freestyle poem rap time. And I'll just try and end on a high, and hopefully they'll forgive the journey. Cool. You ready?
We're ready.
Right. We're here on the Higher Biology podcast. Words coming at me, I got to get on top of them fast. We'll see how we go. I got it in my genes like my genome, and we can do this now. I hope I don't create any schisms, and you can process this like metabolism. We know what we do it at a fast rate. I kind of regret doing this in the first place, but we see what it is. You know what it is. I'm sort of turning green with envy like photosynthesis. We keep going. We're producing this like food. If you don't like it, don't be too rude, because I am technically an animal. Well, yeah. So look after my animal welfare. I know about this. We got to end on a high. Somehow we're going to bring it back in. Some people say that it's in my DNA. I say it's all about deoxyribonucleic acids.
Oh, wow. Yes.
There we go. End on a high.
Where can people go to find your stuff, Harry?
So harrybaker.co is my website. That's got links to lots of different things I do. But otherwise, I'm on various social media. If you just search Harry Baker, it's the one with the poems rather than the chef or photographer or whatever the other Harry Bakers do.
And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favourite platform and follow us on Twitter @BiologyHire.